Welcome. This is Dr. Michio Kaku, Professor of Theoretical Physics at the City College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and this is Exploration. A new star has been observed to have four Earth-like planets going around them. The star is called Tau Ceti, and it's 12 light years from Earth, but four Earth-like planets have been seen going around Tau Ceti. And it means that one day, when we have starships, maybe centuries from now, Tau Ceti will be one of the first stars that humanity will visit, if we last that long, of course. And speaking about lasting that long, it turns out that scientists at Stanford University have come out with a new study analyzing over 100 countries, showing that it's possible by 2050 to be 100% dependent on renewable energy sources. That's right, a 100% dependence on solar, wind, water, and renewable technology. But of course, there are speed bumps along the way to 2050. I'll talk about that. And then we'll say a few things about, believe it or not, happiness. It turns out that at UC Berkeley, where I got my PhD years ago, they're offering an online course, a course on the psychology of happiness. What makes us happy? What makes us sad? Why do people commit suicide? Why are some people just perpetually happy? Well, we'll say a few things about the science, or maybe the lack of science, about happiness studies, because everyone talks about it, but no one ever studies it. Well, let's just jump right into some of the top stories of the past week. The big story, of course, is the fact that the eclipse of 2017 was the most heavily researched eclipse in all of human history. More resources, more scientists were analyzing this eclipse than any other eclipse in human history. In fact, if you count the people on social media, it turns out that this is the one event that has united more people on the planet Earth than any other single event in human history. That's right, not just the United States, but people around the world were tuned into the eclipse via social media. Hundreds of millions of them, making it perhaps the :1 event where the human race communes around one natural event. Now, I was there on April 21st, and at 1:20 in the afternoon, first of all, it got cold. That's right. Everywhere around you, you could see people beginning to huddle up, and it was getting dark, darker and darker by the second. And then, looking up in the sky, it was magnificent. You could see the stars during daytime. Now, when was the last time you could see stars in daytime? But very clearly, I could see the planet Venus. There was the planet Venus. Other of my friends said they saw the planet Mars as well, and the star Regulus. It turns out that, yes, the night sky was beginning to be shown through because the sunlight from the sun no longer blocked it. It was amazing. And then at 1:20 in the afternoon, for 2 minutes and 40 seconds, was a total eclipse of the sun. And it was just like in the textbooks. You could see the corona with the entire disk of the sun covered up. You can see the corona flaming out. And this, of course, is due to a cosmic coincidence. It turns out that the sun is 400 times bigger than the moon. But the sun is also 400 times farther away. And the two 400s cancel each other exactly, giving you this total eclipse. And because we've analyzed about 4,000 planets orbiting other star systems, we realize that the physical parameters of these planets are pretty much random. So, in other words, this total eclipse might be the only total eclipse in this sector of the Milky Way galaxy. Think about that. In the sector of the Milky Way galaxy, chances are there are no total solar eclipses, just like the one that we saw the other day. Now, going down to Missouri, it was quite a feat because, first of all the hotels were booked solid. Fortunately, the people that invited me there at the university booked the hotel about a year ago. But yes, all the hotels were filled with people. In fact, people drove in from places as far as Georgia in order to see the eclipse of the sun in Missouri. And of course, at the university, they passed out glasses, special eclipse glasses, because if you look at the sun directly, there's a chance that you might get retinal damage. So they passed out sunglasses, special sunglasses, to make sure that no one suffered from retinal damage. And then, of course, scientists were out there in droves. And why? Well, we have rockets, we have satellites that can take picture of the sun pretty much anytime we want. But this was special because we could actually zero in on the corona. And that's why this is very interesting. The atmosphere of the sun seems to defy ordinary physics. The atmosphere of the sun is about 1,000,000 degrees, but the surface of the sun is about 10,000 degrees. It shouldn't be that way. It should be the other way around. However, that's the way it is, and we don't know why. And it compounds the mystery because solar flares come out of the atmosphere of the sun. These solar flares, or coronal mass discharges, release huge amounts of radiation into the atmosphere, and like a bullet, they usually miss the Earth. However, once in a while, they graze the planet Earth, and at that point, they can cause blackouts, like what happened in Quebec one year. Or the astronauts at the International Space Station have to go to a special compartment because of the danger of radiation from a solar flare. One day there'll be a direct hit, like what almost happened just a few years ago, a direct hit by one of these gigantic coronal mass ejections. At that point, all hell could break loose. Back in 1859, there was the Carrington event, where a gigantic solar flare did hit the Earth and wiped out telegraph wires. Now, we physicists can calculate what the electric field strength was in 1859, knowing that one fact, the fact that telegraph wires were disrupted. Knowing that one fact, we can then calculate what would happen today, tomorrow, if a coronal mass discharge were to hit the Earth, and of course, it would not be pretty at all. $2 trillion in property damage, that's trillion with a T, not a V. You'd have blackouts because power stations would be short-circuited, satellites would be fried. As a consequence, the internet would go out, weather satellites, telecommunications go out. And with the power supplies going down around the country, refrigerators are going to go on the blink, meaning that food riots could take place because there's no food coming in from neighboring cities because they too have come down with a blackout. Now, we scientists have gone to Congress asking Congress for a pittance, just millions of dollars, in order to create redundant power systems, reinforce our power supply, and create redundancies. All we got was the giggle factor. The Congress people would simply giggle at us, look up in the sky, and say, what? The sun? The sun causing all this property damage? Give me a break. Well, so much for the politicians. Well, we do know that such an event could happen again. And how do we know that? Because we look at ice cores. By digging into the North Pole, we can actually see evidence of the solar flare of 1859 in the ice as we dig deeper and deeper, going backwards in time in the ice. And it turns out if you go even farther, perhaps another 100 years, you see another such Carrington event. So in some sense, we are overdue for another gigantic solar flare. And you can blame Congress for simply giggling at we physicists when we mention that horrendous possibility. And speaking about outer space, scientists have found that a star called Tau Ceti has not one, not two, not three, but four Earth-like planets going around the star, and it's only 12 light years from Earth, a hop, skip, and a jump. Now, why are scientists so amazed by that, given the fact that the closest star to the Earth, Proxima Centauri, it also has an Earth-like planet going around it? You see, there's a problem. Even though Proxima Centauri is the closest star to the Earth, it is a red dwarf. And because it's a red dwarf, solar flares from the surface of the sun can scorch the surface of any nearby planet going around the habitable zone. So in other words, we don't expect life as we know it to flourish on a planet going around the closest star to the Earth, which is Proxima Centauri b. However, Tau Ceti, the star that I just mentioned, is actually a yellow star, almost like a twin of the sun. And so as a consequence, we don't think it's going to be scorched by solar flares from the sun. And as a consequence, it could mean that of the 4 Earth-like planets going around that star, perhaps one of them may have the conditions for life itself. It will be in the habitable zone. The habitable zone is sometimes called the Goldilocks zone because the temperature is just right to have liquid water. Not too close, because then water will boil. Not too far, because then water will freeze. But just right to have liquid water. Now, why is that so important? Because liquid water is the amniotic fluid from which life was created. In other words, it is the universal solvent. It dissolves most substances, especially hydrocarbons and organic chemicals. It dissolves them and creates a mixing bowl out of which you can create proteins, amino acids, and of course, DNA. And once you have one DNA molecule, just one DNA molecule growing in the oceans, it means that then you'll have 2, because it reproduces itself. Then 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, until you populate all the oceans. We think something similar to that happened on our Earth, perhaps 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. Perhaps there was an event in our oceans which created the first DNA molecule. Now, of course, DNA requires energy, and that energy comes from the sun. But back then, there was no sunlight down at the bottom of the ocean to create life. So we think that it was volcano vents. We think it was hot water vents on the bottom of the ocean that gave enough heat to create the first DNA molecule. And the rest, as they say, is history. We are here as a consequence of that fact. Now also remember that about 4,000 planets have been observed going around other star systems. And of them, well, most of them are Jupiter-sized, so we don't think that there's life as we know it on those planets. But a handful of them are in the Goldilocks zone. A handful of them have the right mass. They are candidates for life in outer space. And then the next question is, well, what about the planet Earth? What are some of the problems that afflict us? Because when we look in outer space, we don't see evidence of any alien life forms, but they should be there. Life should be plentiful in the Milky Way galaxy, but we see no evidence of intelligent life in our sector of the galaxy. Why is that? We don't know. One possibility, however, is that they let their technology go too far and they blew themselves up, or they scorched their planet, they poisoned themselves, any number of ways to commit planetary suicide. So then the question is, what about the Earth? Will we have the foresight to go to a renewable, clean technology to create our energy? Or are we going to use coal and fossil fuels? Well, here's a new report from Stanford University, which looked at the energy production of about 130 nations around the Earth. And then, using this number, they then calculate when, with a reasonable set of assumptions, these countries could go 100% renewable. Now, of course, we don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. However, with a few mild assumptions, these scientists at Stanford University came up with the astounding conclusion that by the year 2050, these nations could go 100% renewable. That is depending on solar, wind, conservation, and water. I mean, think about that, 100% solar. Now, of course, the scientists at Stanford University had to make some assumptions. One assumption they made was they did not include nuclear energy in the mix. Why is that? Because in their opinion, nuclear energy's fortune is just too unstable. It's too expensive for Wall Street for the most part. Takes too long to build. There's very expensive, and there are all sorts of cost overruns and delays. Nuclear waste, we still don't know what to do with nuclear waste 50 years into the nuclear age. And they suffer meltdowns once in a while, like what happened at 3 Mile Island, or Chernobyl or Fukushima. So in other words, they decided not to include uranium, but still they came out with the fact that by 2050, things look good. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to happen. That just means that if the nations of the world, 130 of them, put some of their thoughts together and took a cold, hard look at energy production, that in principle, they could go 100% energy independent of fossil fuels by the year 2050. And there are a lot of good signs. First of all, battery power. Batteries are very useful, of course, for storing energy from wind and solar when the sun doesn't shine and the winds don't blow. Battery prices have been dropping about 7% per year. And that, of course, is very good. In fact, people like Elon Musk, the genius behind SpaceX and Tesla Motors and PayPal, he's invested heavily in battery technology as the way to bring solar power to the marketplace. And so that's another good sign. Now, some people may say, look at President Donald Trump. He's going to pull the United States out of the Paris Accords. We're going backwards, not forwards. But look at carefully. It turns out that it takes about 3 years to leave the Paris Accords. And in 3 years' time, we're going to have another election. So once again, all bets are off. So in other words, just because at the present time, the president wants to pull out of the Paris Accords, doesn't mean at all that this is going to be a step backwards. Because, as I mentioned, it takes about 3 years to pull out of the Paris Accords. And there's so much momentum already built up in places like Japan and Europe that have heavily invested in conservation and wind power and solar. There's so much momentum being built up that it's very hard for one nation to reverse that momentum. And then here's a rather interesting story from science. Happiness studies. That's right. When you were in college, didn't you want to take a course on how to be happy? It sounds like a real gut course, right? An easy course to pad your resume. But it turns out that at UC Berkeley, where I got my PhD in physics years ago, it turns out that at the University of California at Berkeley, they're offering a course, an online course for the first time called Happiness Studies. Now, you may say to yourself, that's kind of a goofy course. But if you think about it, happiness is what drives most people. When people are unhappy, they do strange things. They commit suicide. They commit crimes. They get divorced. They ruin their family and their future when they're unhappy. So what is the basis of happiness? Well, some things you can actually write down on a sheet of paper and test in the laboratory. Well, first of all, there seems to be a happiness set point. That's right. Some people literally are born intrinsically happy. Like a thermostat, there does seem to be a happiness set point. These people have been studied by science. These people can suffer horrendous injuries in an accident. They could lose their job and lose part of their family, and yet they come back. They bounce right back and they say to themselves, it could have been worse. It could have been much worse. I am so lucky to have survived that car accident. Other people have a very low set point. That no matter what you do, no matter how things are going their way, they're just not happy at all. And so some scientists think that happiness set point is partly genetic. Maybe it's part of our hardwiring of our brain and genetics. Now, in addition to the happiness set point, happiness is also relative. If you are in a poor village, in a poor country, for example, sometimes you could be very happy because you know that, well, everybody in the village is poor just like you, and you happen to be a little bit better off than some of your neighbors. And so happiness is relative. In fact, when scientists study happiness, they find that many people look around and they judge their lot in life by other people's fortune or misfortune. And so we get our bearings by our friends. Now, it turns out that this is also important when it comes to war and peace. For example, look at North Korea. The people of North Korea are starving to death. So why don't they simply all revolt and change the government? Well, you see, dictators are not stupid. They know that if the people are kept uneducated, they don't know what's happening in the outside world, they think that, well, everybody must be miserable. There's no point in rebelling because it's just as bad outside as it is inside. And so dictators know this. And that's why dictators are very careful, extremely careful, to control what people hear. For example, during the Cold War, the CIA, of course, was famous for beaming messages, TV and radio into the Iron Curtain countries so that the people there could see all the, quote, luxuries, unquote, of the West. And so they planted in the minds of the people living in the Soviet bloc countries the fact that there could be a better life out there, that happiness is relative, and you are relatively unhappy because you live in a society where people are not allowed to be happy and control their own destiny. And many people think that that had a lot to do with the fact that the people of Eastern Europe overthrew the shackles of communism so rapidly and so quickly. So in other words, according to this one theory, we oscillate. We oscillate around a set point. According to this theory, all of us have a happiness set point that's set perhaps maybe sometime after birth. And we oscillate around that on the basis of our relative place in society. So it's a combination of the two, a set point and the feeling of being happiness or unhappy relative to others. And then lastly, there's also the question of long-term happiness. When everything is said and done, once you enter old age, what makes you happy? Well, scientists there find something very interesting. They find out that social ties, family, social ties have a lot to do with your sense of well-being and happiness when you get older. In fact, you can delay Alzheimer's. You can delay Alzheimer's by having a large and very close social network. People who are isolated tend to have problems with Alzheimer's at a higher rate than people who are connected socially. Second of all, to be happy in the long term, it's good to have a feeling of self-worth, a feeling that you've done something or should do something for the benefit of society. That's important. Then the question is, if this theory is correct, then why are some people unhappy? Unhappy to the point of suicide. Now, if you believe in Darwin's theory of evolution, suicide doesn't make any sense at all. According to Darwin, we want to live, survive, to have children who will propagate our genes. And those people who do not have a happy life having children, they'll not propagate their genes, and their descendants aren't here to talk about it, so we don't have to talk about these individuals. So why is there suicide? Well, there are many theories, of course, but one theory depends on evolution. And that is, interviews with people who have contemplated suicide have a feeling that they are a drain on their family. Not just that they feel useless or unhappy because of misfortune. No, it's more than that. They feel that they are a drain on their family. Now think about this for a moment. They think that if they commit suicide, then their relatives will have a better ability to have a good life as a consequence of their committing suicide. In other words, their relatives have a higher chance of passing on their genes. And so in other words, there is an evolutionary theory of suicide, that people commit suicide not just because they feel bad, because of course that would violate Darwin's theory of evolution, but they commit suicide as part of an evolutionary process, that these people believe that by committing suicide, they'll increase their relatives' ability to propagate their genes, to have children who will then propagate the gene line. So in other words, who knows for sure, but there is an evolutionary theory of suicide, that suicide is not just being unhappy. It's more than that. It's more than just feeling bad one day. It's the feeling that you are a drain on the family and that, quote, life would be better without you. In fact, when I wrote a biography of Albert Einstein, there was one point in his life where he actually contemplated suicide. He couldn't get a job. He got a PhD, but he made such a bad impression upon his professors that they wrote horrible letters of recommendation for him, and he couldn't get a job. He felt he was a drain on his family as a consequence. He got very depressed, and he wrote to his friends saying that he thought he became a burden on his family. And then the tragedy was when his father died. When his father died, he was very close to his father. When his father died thinking that his son was a failure, a loser. Well, it's really a shame that the father couldn't live just for a few more years, just 3-4 more years. Because in those years, Albert Einstein would shake world history by proposing one of the greatest theories in all of physics, the theory of relativity. But unfortunately, in 1902, Einstein could not get a job. And he contemplated suicide. In fact, he even contemplated becoming a door-to-door salesman. Can you imagine hearing a knock on the door, opening the door, and there's Albert Einstein selling you life insurance? Think about that. Well, when talking about happiness, there's another factor you should consider, and that is resilience, the ability to bounce back. Even if you are unhappy one day, it's a test of your character, whether you can take stock of your situation, learn from it, bounce back, and go on to even greater glory. And that's what Albert Einstein did, even though at one point in his life, he began to contemplate suicide. So in other words, in addition to happiness and sadness, you have to factor in yet another characteristic, and that is resilience. Well, I'm afraid that's it for the first part of Exploration. Once again, this is Dr. Michio Kaku, Professor of Theoretical Physics at the City College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Stay tuned now for the second half when we bring on Professor Steven Pinker of Harvard University talking about the mind. How is the mind constructed? How do we deal with threats and happiness? And is it a blank slate or are we genetically programmed? So once again, our special guest is Harvard Professor Steven Pinker talking about the secrets of the mind. Is it genetics or are we a blank slate? Well, in this part of Exploration, we're going to talk about the mind. And our special guest in this segment is Professor Steven Pinker of Harvard University, author of another controversial book called The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature. And the question is human nature programmed at birth? Is it just a matter of genetics? Or is it a question of being learned by interacting with the environment? Well, this nature-nurture controversy is very old, but recent evidence seems to clarify exactly how much comes from nature and how much comes from nurture. And this, of course, also goes to the core difference between liberals and conservatives. Human nature, is it infinitely pliable, or is it hardwired from the very beginning? That, of course, determines your politics in terms of what you think can be accomplished through legislation, through different kinds of social movements. And now I'd like to introduce our very special guest today. We're delighted to have with us Professor Steven Pinker. He's a professor of psychology at Harvard University, formerly of MIT, and he's the author of a controversial and delightful new book called The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature. Of all the issues affecting modern industrialized society, perhaps one of the most contentious, splitting the left and the right, from liberals to conservatives, is the question of how far can you mold human behavior with social policy? Liberals, for example, like to believe that humans are in some sense a blank slate and that social policies can remold the human character. Well, conservatives say not so fast. If you take a look at the DNA data, if you take a look at twin studies of twins separated at birth, they say that there's a core, or core set of values that are in some sense hardwired or genetically programmed into our bodies. And it's silly to fight against these core set of human values and human nature. Well, who's right? Well, once again, our special guest today is Professor Steven Pinker of Harvard, and the book is called The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature. The first question for you, Professor Pinker, is why did you become a cognitive scientist? I mean, after all, when we're little boys play with G.I. Joe dolls and He-Man dolls, and here you are looking at the brain and pushing the frontiers of linguistics and how the brain functions. So how did you first get interested in brain science?
I think it came from an interest in human nature, and part of it was growing up in the 1960s when people were discussing the optimal form of social organization, as if you could redesign society from scratch. And that depends a lot on what you think makes people tick. So how the brain works was a question, at least implicitly, that was in the air. The problem was that it had a kind of squishy or airy-fairy feel to it when it stated at that level of generality. When I found that in college that there was a field called cognitive science that could actually study what makes people tick in the lab and gather data and formulate testable theories, I knew that's what I wanted to do.
Okay, and why did you decide to write a book called The Blank Slate?
Well, in studying how the mind works, studying how language works, often you come up against objections that really don't come from the scientific claims themselves, but rather come from some fear that certain kinds of scientific claims are politically or morally dangerous. And I think that influences not just the public in how they react to the science, but sometimes the scientists themselves. There are areas they don't want to go into, there are questions they don't want to ask, or conclusions that they resist because of these political and moral colorings. So I thought it was best to put them out into the open, to confront what the implications are and are not about different discoveries about the human mind, so that we can separate the politics from the science.
And speaking about the politics, there are trends. Things come and go. At one point, we talked about the noble savage. At other points, we talked about the ghost in the machine. And at other points in history, people talked about the blank slate. So tell us a little bit about those three and how they've sort of come and gone over the years. And what are your particular points of view?
Yes, all three of these ideas really came from the Enlightenment and the discussions among philosophers at the time over the human mind and indeed over political arrangements and theological implications. So I come up with catchy names for these three ideas, which I think have continued to be in our culture a kind of secular religion, something that people believe in even if they don't invoke God explicitly. The blank slate is the idea that we are not born with any talents or temperaments, and that the entire structure of the mind comes from culture and socialization and society, that we have no innate tendencies whatsoever. The noble savage is the corollary that says that anything that we find dislikable about human behavior, selfishness, lust, greed, fear of strangers, desire for power, competitiveness, are all products of corrupt social institutions and are not part of our nature. And that humans in a more natural state, such as the one enjoyed by hunter-gatherers, free from government and social institutions, would naturally live in harmony and peace. Finally, the third idea is the ghost in the machine, which is that we are, in addition to our bodies and brains, immaterial beings called souls, or minds or spirits, and that you can't reduce human thought and behavior to the physiological activity of the brain, but there's some extra invisible ingredient, the soul, which infuses us and allows us to make choices and experience the world.
Now, this, of course, has social repercussions in some sense that if you have a criminal, some people would say that you can reform that criminal, that perhaps their criminal behavior was a byproduct of poverty and that the human personality is malleable. Other people may say, bah, humbug, that there are some innate things within us and certain things are doomed to fail. So where do you fall in this political spectrum, and what's your take on those three philosophies?
Right. Well, certainly criminal behavior is not a particularly sensible scientific category. If it were, then probably two-thirds of people under the age of 25 would be criminals for downloading music on the internet, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But if we look at particular kinds of behavior that are that we can kind of define independent of criminality, such as violent tendencies. On the one hand, there are many variations in violent tendencies that have nothing to do with genes or innate tendencies. The fact that societies can go from being militant to peaceable in a generation shows that it can't all be in the genes. You and I had an earlier conversation in which you pointed out that Japan, for example, went from highly militaristic to one of the world's most pacifist societies in a very short period of time. And changes like that have happened many times in history. On the other hand, within a given society, there are differences among people in their willingness to inflict harm. Criminologists note that even in very violent parts of the country, such as some American inner cities, a small number of the people commit a disproportionate number of the violent acts. And also, so it means that within a culture, some of the variation depends on the individual, and studies of twins, such as identical twins reared apart, and comparisons of identical and fraternal twins, show that some of that variation is due to differences in genes. Moreover, all people, I think, have the capacity to react violently in certain circumstances. We see that whenever the force of law and government disappears, violence breaks out, suggesting that even in social conditions in which people inhibit their tendencies toward violence, they're waiting to break out if not properly constrained by the cultural context. So the answer, as in almost all questions of nature and nurture, is that it's an interplay of both, and it depends whether you're talking about an entire ethnic group, about individuals, about different times in history that you're comparing, and so on.
Okay, let's be specific about some of the hot-button issues that you mentioned in your book, like feminism, raising of children, violence. Let's get right into some of these hot-button issues, including violence. Now, a liberal may approach this issue by saying if you take a look at an unemployed male in a poor area, well, there seems to be a gene for violence, and that is the male gene. However, the way to deal with it is not to have some kind of eugenics, but to give them a job. Studies have shown that when male criminals get married, their crime rate drops enormously, and the key to getting married is having economic stability, and the key to that is jobs. So liberal would say perhaps jobs is the way to deal with the problem, and however, a conservative may come in and say, now, wait a minute, I mean, sometimes you can't rehabilitate people. Sometimes it's a waste of money to do these things. Well, where do you fit on some of these things, and what do you think should be done on the question of violence in society?
Well, I think the positions aren't mutually exclusive, and I think both of them have merit. Certainly, there are many data, including studies of changes in hormones, that show that when men hitch up and get married, their tendency toward violence goes down, for reasons that many evolutionary psychologists have discussed, such as that men, when they are competing for a mate, will strive for a reputation for toughness and status and esteem, which will include inflicting revenge on anyone who disses them or compromises their interests. And so if you have men in a situation in which they're more likely to get married, they'll spend less of their energy competing on the streets, and indeed their testosterone levels and other hormones will go down in response. Certainly the idea that providing economic conditions in which men can find jobs would likely lead to a reduction in the crime rate. Although criminologists will also say that there's a lot of fluctuation in the crime rate that can't be explained by economic conditions, such as in the last 3 years there's been a reduction in the crime rate even as the economy has gotten worse. There's a lot in the fluctuation of crime rates that no one understands, is my understanding. But in addition, holding all of that constant, whether the crime rate is high or the crime rate is low, there are some individuals who have an utterly callous attitude towards the suffering or well-being of other people. These are the people we call psychopaths. There is evidence that psychopaths can't be rehabilitated, that psychopathy may be partly genetic, partly due to unknown causes. And in cases like that, I think one has to not be too romantic and say if we release someone who has raped or tortured or killed, and we don't know what to do with them, we might be better off preventing them from harming other innocent women or children or adults in the future. And the willingness to incapacitate someone who has a high probability of harming someone else doesn't preclude attention to more general social and political changes that might lead to a reduction in crime statistically across the whole country.
Well, let me play devil's advocate for a moment. A liberal may come in at this point and say that, well, the bulk of crimes are committed by unsocialized males of single mothers. And on each point, they are social problems. The fact that there is a single mother, the fact that you have an unsocialized male, son of a single mother, these are things that could be rectified through social policy. Conservatives say, not so fast, not so fast. There are innate human characteristics which are very difficult to unwire. Well, what are your thoughts about whether or not it's possible through social policy to change these unsocialized males of single mothers, or whether that's really the problem at all?
Yes. Well, there are a number of issues. I mean, again, these aren't mutually exclusive, that there may be some individuals who are more prone to violence in just about any social situation. There may be some that are more prone to violence in some circumstances, such as after growing up in a tough neighborhood where you've got to defend your interests by a reputation for machismo, whereas in another circumstance they might enhance their reputation by verbal argumentation or by competing in music. Going back to the liberal-conservative divide, though, in fairness to conservatives, the standard response, I anticipate to your question, would be that indeed single motherhood is a cause of crime, and that the cause of single motherhood is the welfare policies that allow women to support babies without getting married, therefore giving men a free ride. They can get all the sex they want without bearing the responsibility of marrying the mother of their children and supporting them. If you've got the government taking over the role of husbands and fathers, there'll be less of a demand for husbands and fathers, and you'll have more single mothers and hence more crime. I think that is the more standard conservative response to your question. Concerns about eugenics and bad seeds and violent genes are actually pretty rare among conservatives over the past few decades.
Okay, let's also talk about the institution of war. A liberal may say that perhaps we should try more negotiations, perhaps more reason. A conservative would say, bah, humbug, look at human history. War seems to be a constant, and it's a dangerous world out there, and might makes right, and nations only respect force. So what are your thoughts on the question of war?
Well, I probably am not very well equipped to give much of a general answer. I certainly think that depending on the adversary, either of those strategies might be appropriate. The thing about violence is that it's an example of what game theorists call a prisoner's dilemma, that often the best solution would be for both sides to back down simultaneously and to negotiate their differences. Unfortunately, it can also happen that if one side goes to war and the other one backs down, the victor will get the spoils. And so even though it can be to everyone's advantage if both sides back down at once, if one side refuses to back down, the other side may have little choice but to confront them head on. Ideally, what you would like is enough knowledge of the lessons of history and of the way in which everyone could come out ahead by dividing the contested resources that both sides would back down simultaneously and everyone could have the best possible outcome. The problem is if you're facing an adversary who fails to see it that way, in that case, unilateral pacifism can be the worst possible outcome, such as in the case of say, opposing Hitler prior to the Second World War. So I think there's no general answer. It depends on the particular guy on the other side. One just has to realize that these two options might be differently desirable depending on who you're facing.
Well, several years ago, there was a controversy about, I think it was a government-funded conference on genetics and violence. Now, of course, there is a genetic link to violence, and that is the male gene. However, African Americans and civil rights activists said, whoa, we don't want our taxpayers' money to fund this because it gives you the indication that perhaps races could be, quote, more prone, unquote, genetically to become violent, and that here was government money fostering what they thought was a bogus idea. Well, what does the science say about the question of race and violence?
Yes, actually, that conference was on the biology of violence, not specifically on the genetics of violence. Mm-hmm. And so it also looked at effects of abuse, effects of mothers ingesting drugs during pregnancy. The approach of that conference was actually to look at violence as a public health problem like tobacco or environmental pollutants. And in fact, it had a rather liberal agenda. The people opposing it really didn't know what it was about and really spread rather paranoid rumors about it being about racial differences in tendencies toward violence, mm-hmm. which none of the participants had actually planned to talk about. I don't think we have any reason to believe that there are innate differences among ethnic groups or races in their propensity toward violence, simply because if you take a historic view, cultures can switch from militant to pacifist or vice versa in a remarkably short period of time. I think if 100 years ago, one would have said that one day the Germans, the Japanese would be the world's strongest pacifists, and there would be a nation of pugnacious soldiers from the descendants of Jews in the European ghettos, they would have laughed you out of the room. But that's the situation we have now, and it shows that the differences in ethnic groups are almost certainly due to differences in the circumstances that they face.
So therefore, what is genetic? What is hardwired into the brain? Some studies, I think, on Dutch families have shown that there is a streak of violence in some families, but part of that is related to testosterone levels that are controlled genetically, we think. So therefore, if the question of violence is malleable, that societies can become warlike one day and pacifist the next, then what is hardwired in the brain?
Well, I tend to avoid the word hardwired because it implies that given a particular organism, they're like wind-up dolls or robots that can only behave in the same way across every situation. I think that what is innate is a set of strategies for dealing with the environment that you face, that you're currently facing, and that in different environments, different psychological responses will be triggered, which will lead to more or less violence depending on the social circumstance. One of them will be the degree of threat that you perceive. Another will be the presence of an armed authority, police force or government that you can call in to settle your scores for you. Another will be whether you feel that your honor has been compromised, whether you've lost face, and that if you don't regain respect and face, you'll be a punching bag or a sitting duck. When that perception is triggered, people are likely to engage in violence just to prove how tough they are. When they feel that they don't have to show off a pugnacious side in order to defend their interests, when they can call 911 for the police to show up, then they're less likely to challenge each other to duels or to kill each other over trivial insults. Those are some of the kind of the if-then rules that we're equipped with that don't make anyone therefore very few people likely to burst out in violence across the board, but can lead to violence being triggered if the circumstances are right.
Okay, now let's talk about another hot-button issue, and that is gender, and that is the role of women. In your book, you actually make a differentiation between two kinds of feminism. So could you elaborate now on the question of the blank slate and feminism?
Yes, there's many people believe that feminism must be committed to the doctrine of the blank slate, that if we come into the world with nothing in our minds or brains, then there can't possibly be differences between little boys and little girls that are due to biology, and therefore that's the best way to ensure gender equity. Therefore, according to this line of reasoning, one should resist any tendency to say that men and women have any innate differences, or just to be on the safe side, resist any tendency that anyone has anything innate whatsoever in order to maximize the chances of ensuring gender equity. I dispute this line of argument largely out of sympathy to feminism rather than hostility, that I don't think feminist ideals should be held hostage to what comes out of the lab on the source of gender differences. And I borrow a distinction from a philosopher, Christina Hoff Sommers, who distinguishes between equity feminism and gender feminism. Equity feminism is the classical liberal position associated with the first wave of feminism, that discrimination against people on the basis of gender is evil and is counterproductive to society, that no one should be discriminated against based on the traits of an entire gender. Gender feminism, on the other hand, is the belief that men and women are born identical, and that all differences between the sexes come from socialization, and that there is a vast male conspiracy to hold women down, which is the source of all differences between the sexes. The problem with gender feminism is that it's an empirical hypothesis. As the hypothesis begins to be disproven, in fact, it's already been disproven, it makes feminism vulnerable. Anti-feminists could say, well, the basis of feminism, that boys and girls are identical, has been refuted. Therefore, let's go back to the 50s. I think a way to protect feminism is to say that questions of equity, of non-discrimination, are independent of statistical differences between the sexes or their source, and we should separate our commitment to equity from our empirical studies of where sex differences come from.
Okay, well, let's talk about little boys and little girls. Most liberals think that the propensity for girls to gravitate toward Barbie dolls and boys toward He-Man dolls and G.I. Joe is cultural. However, then they have children of their own. And then they realize that whatever it is, it starts awfully early, that little tykes will begin to gravitate toward certain kinds of gender-based toys. And the question is that a byproduct of our media saturation, that everywhere you go you see images of women and men in certain roles? Or is there really something in the human brain that means that boys and girls have different outlooks toward toys?
I think there is something in the brain. One bit of evidence is the experience of parents who do everything in their power to present sex-reversed role models to their children, and then discover that children left to their own devices will just gravitate towards the same activities. Another is the fact that you see even in other species sex differences, that vervet monkeys, the young males prefer to play with objects compared to the young females. They certainly haven't been exposed to television.
And that's it for the second half of Exploration. Once again, our special guest has been Professor Steven Pinker, professor of psychology at Harvard, author of the new book, The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature.